and 48. These several passages of Scripture prove that there will be different degrees of punishment in hell, which is utterly inconsistent with the supposition that punishment consists in annihilation, in which there can be no degrees, but is the same thing to everyone who is the subject of it. 4. The Scriptures are very express and abundant in teaching that the eternal punishment of the wicked shall consist of sensible misery and torment, not annihilation. What is said of Judas is worthy to be observed here. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Matthew chapter 26, verse 24. This seems plainly to teach us that the punishment of the wicked is such that their existence upon the whole is worse than non-existence. But if their punishment consists merely in annihilation, this is not true. The wicked, in their punishment, are said to weep and wail and gnash their teeth. Matthew chapter 13, verse 42, which implies not only real existence, but life, knowledge, and activity, and that they are in a very sensible and exquisite manner affected with their punishment. In Isaiah chapter 33, verse 14, sinners in the state of their punishment are represented as dwelling with everlasting burnings. But if they are only turned into nothing, where is the foundation for this representation? It is absurd to say that sinners will dwell with annihilation, for there is no dwelling in that case. It is also absurd to call annihilation a burning, which implies a state of existence, sensibility, and extreme pain, whereas in annihilation there is neither one nor another of these. The state of the future punishment of the wicked is evidently represented to be a state of existence and sensibility, when it is said that they shall be cast into a lake of fire and brimstone. Revelation chapter 19, verse 20. How can this expression with any propriety be understood to mean a state of annihilation? Yes, they are expressly said to have no rest, day or night, but to be tormented with fire and brimstone forever and ever. Revelation chapter 20, verse 10. But annihilation is a state of rest, a state in which not the least torment can possibly be suffered. The rich man in Hades lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and saw Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom, and entered into a particular conversation with Abraham, all of which proves that he was not annihilated. Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. The spirits of ungodly men, before the resurrection, are not in a state of annihilation, but in a state of misery. They are spirits in prison, as the apostle says of them, that were drowned in the flood. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19. And this appears very plainly from the instance of the rich man before mentioned, if we consider him as representing the wicked in their separate state between death and the resurrection. But if the wicked even then are in a state of torment, much more will they be when they shall come to suffer that which is the proper punishment of their sins. Annihilation is not so great a calamity, but that some men would have undoubtedly chosen it, rather than such a state of suffering as they have been in, even in this life. This was the case of Job, a good man. But if a good man in this world may suffer that which is worse than annihilation, doubtless the proper punishment of the wicked, in which God means to manifest his peculiar abhorrence of their wickedness, will be a calamity vastly greater still, and therefore cannot be annihilation. That must be a very mean and contemptible testimony of God's wrath towards those who have rebelled against his crown and dignity, have broken his laws, and have despised both his vengeance and his grace, which is not so great a calamity as some of his true children have suffered in this life. The eternal punishment of the wicked is said to be the second death, once and again, as Revelation chapter 20, verse 14, and 21, verse 8. It is doubtless called the second death in reference to the death of the body, As the death of the body is ordinarily attended with great pain and distress, so the like, or something vastly greater, is implied in calling the eternal punishment of the wicked the second death. There would be no propriety in calling it so if it consisted merely in annihilation. This second death wicked men will suffer, for it cannot be called the second death with respect to any other than men. It cannot be called so with respect to devils, as they die no temporal death, which is the first death. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 11, it is said, "He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death," implying that all who do not overcome their lusts, but live in sin, shall suffer the second death. Again, wicked men will suffer the same kind of death with the devils, as in the 41st verse of Matthew 25, "Depart ye cursed into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." Now the punishment of the devil is not annihilation, but torment. He therefore trembles for fear of it, not for fear of being annihilated. He would be glad of that. But what he is afraid of is torment, as appears in Luke chapter 8, verse 28, where he cries out and beseeches Christ that he would not torment him before the time. It is said, "The devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." Revelation chapter 20, verse 10. It is strange how men will go directly against so plain and full revelations of Scripture as to suppose, notwithstanding all these things, that the eternal punishment against the wicked signifies no more than annihilation. 3. As the future punishment of the wicked consists in sensible misery, so it shall not only continue for a very long time, but shall be absolutely without end. Of those who have held that the torments of hell are not absolutely eternal, there have been two sorts. A. Some suppose that in the threatenings of everlasting punishment, the terms used do not necessarily import a proper eternity, but only a very long duration. B. Others suppose that if they do import a proper eternity, yet we cannot necessarily conclude thence that God will fulfill his threatenings. Therefore I shall show that the threatenings of eternal punishment do very plainly and fully import a proper absolute eternity, and not merely a long duration. This appears, A, because when the Scripture speaks of the wicked being sentenced to their punishment at the time when all temporal things are come to an end, it speaks of it as everlasting, as in the text and elsewhere. It is true that the term forever is not always used in Scripture to signify eternity. Sometimes it means as long as a man lives. In this sense, it is said that the Hebrew servant who chose to abide with his master should have his ear bored, and should serve his master forever. Exodus chapter 21, verse 6. Sometimes it means during the continuance of the state and church of the Jews. In this sense, several laws which were peculiar to that church and were to continue in force no longer than that church should last are called statutes forever. Exodus chapter 27, verse 21, and Exodus chapter 28, verse 43. Sometimes it means as long as the world stands. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 4, "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever." This last is the longest temporal duration that such a term is used to signify. There is no instance of using such a term for a long duration when it signifies a temporal duration, for the duration of the world is doubtless the longest of any of those things that are temporal, as its beginning was the earliest of any of those things that are temporal. Therefore, when the Scripture speaks of things as being before the foundation of the world, it means that they existed from eternity and before the beginning of time. So those things which continue after the end of the world are eternal things and are after the end of time. Doubtless, When the temporal world is at an end, there will be an end to temporal things. When the time comes that heaven and earth are shaken and removed, those things that remain will be things that cannot be shaken, but will remain forever. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 26 and 27. This visible world contains all things that are seen and are temporal. Therefore, when that is at an end, there will be an end of all things that are temporal, and the things that remain after that will be eternal. The punishment of the wicked will not only remain after the end of the world, but it is called everlasting, as in the text, "These shall go away into everlasting punishment."